For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. In our special series, Borderline Xi Jinping, we are looking at 10 years since Xi Jinping came to power and the aggressive nature of China's behavior on several borders. Our guests today are Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao and Lisa Curtis. Welcome, Ambassador Rao, joining us from Kunnur, and Lisa Curtis in Washington, D.C. Thank you both so much for your time.
It's great to be here.
Wonderful to be here, Amitabh.
Pleasure's all ours. Ambassador Rao, Galwan changed the normal in so many ways. What's your reading really of the last skirmish that China and India had, the December 9th last year Yangtse attempt that was repulsed?
Well, Amitabh, I think it just points to the extremely unsettled and tense state of affairs along the line of actual control between India and China. The Chinese have been increasingly active, increasingly assertive, you could even say aggressive. And obviously, from the Indian side, we have had to take countermeasures to safeguard our sovereignty and our territory. But the underlying fact is the reality of an unsettled border between the two countries, huge territorial claims from each side on the other, and the complete absence, the disappearance really since Galwan, of mutual trust. So the relationship is at its nadir today.
At its nadir, Lisa Curtis, but the Yangtse in the Tibet sector in Arunachal Pradesh, December 2022, in your reading, why did the PLA attempt this another incremental land grab, salami slicing as it's known?
Well, it's always difficult to discern what the precise motivations of the Chinese are when it comes to the India-China border. But several people have speculated that it may have been in reaction to military exercise between Indian and U.S. forces. And this took place within 60 miles or so of the line of actual control. Farther north than Taiwan, certainly, but still, the fact that these exercises were taking part between the U.S. and India so close to the line of actual control, certainly China was not happy with that. And they made a statement criticizing those exercises and actually saying they went against some of the agreements that India and China had made in the 1990s. Now, of course, China itself has not been respecting those agreements that were made between the two countries. And really, despite having relatively peaceful borders between India and China for 25 years, from the 1980s till about 2013, but in the last decade, we have seen increasingly aggressive actions by the Chinese to assert their territorial claims along the border. And unfortunately, the agreements that have been made in the 90s and early 2000s have not been respected, and they're nearly ineffective at keeping the peace between India and China. So I think this incident that happened on December 9th, my understanding is several hundred PLA soldiers tried to cross the border, but India was able to sort of repulse the attempt. And fortunately, no lives were lost in that particular flare-up on the border. But I think it's just a harbinger of things to come. I think that we are likely to continue to see these scuffles happening along the border increasingly.
Amitabh, if I may just...
go ahead,
Amitabh,
Ambassador.
I'd like to add that as far as the Yangtse area or subsector is concerned, this has always been a point of very active dispute between India and China. And as you know, the very alignment of the McMahon line is disputed by China in this sector. And we've had numerous incidents involving the Chinese entering into our side over the years. Of course, you might argue that since 2013, the situation along the LAC has become increasingly fluid, and particularly so since 2017, after the Doklam incident in Bhutan. And the Chinese have, really showed their face, as you know, at Galwan and the tragedy that followed. But Yangtse has a very deep historical association with the whole India-China border dispute. And it's through this sector that the Dalai Lama entered India in March 1959. In fact, March 31st was the anniversary of his entry into India. So one, as Lisa says, the situation, one can expect more of this kind of activity from the Chinese side. And let us also remember that the eastern sector of the India-China border is what China calls the sector of the largest dispute. We've had a lot of concentration of activity in Ladakh and eastern Ladakh over these last few years, and perhaps all our focus has turned in that direction. But let's not forget that this whole area of Arunachal Pradesh is disputed, except for a small subdivision, by China. And there is, need to be eternally vigilant.
Sure. And also would like to point out, we just come back, in fact, from that area, Ambassador and Ms. Curtis, and Yangtze itself has great spiritual significance because of the waterfalls that are there, and how China, again, at one instant represses religion, but weaponizes as well. But Ambassador, just wanted to get your thoughts on the latest, which is Home Minister Amit Shah, China objecting to him going to Arunachal Pradesh. He spent the night in Kibutu in a border village there. Prior to that, the Chinese released a third list of what India calls invented names in Arunachal Pradesh. Ambassador, how should India be responding to all of this?
Well, the Chinese tend to always react. They've been very hyperactive in reacting to any visits by high-level personages from our side, and including, as you know, when His Holiness the Dalai Lama has been to Tawang, they have upped the ante and protested very vociferously against such visits. So I think we should be able to, we have to understand that China is bound to react whenever we do, whenever we have such visits, or whenever such important personalities from our side make their appearance in these border areas. I don't think we should be deterred by what the Chinese do and say. We are basically asserting our sovereign right to visit these areas, to consolidate our presence in these border areas. So why not? I remember, a visit to Depsang in 1989, way back in 1989, 35 years ago, 35 years ago, and the entire village of Depsang had shut down at that time. And what were they doing? They were watching Ramayana on Doordarshan. And, so our reach into those areas has been quite long-standing. And we should continue to be able to state with firmness and with clarity what our position is about consolidating our presence in these border areas and strengthening the infrastructure, strengthening our reach into these areas, and providing confidence to local inhabitants that India is there to constantly support them. And I think in that sense, you may look at the Home Minister's visit in that light.
The third list that the Chinese put out came soon after the Bhutanese king was here. But Lisa Curtis, the last point that the ambassador is raising about infrastructure, and the report that you've just released, that you're the co-author of, points out on how India is looking to accelerate infrastructure development. I'm talking specifically about Arunachal, but it's all along the border and the LAC. And your report even says that India has narrowed the infrastructure differential. And I can tell you, since we've just come back from Arunachal and Tawang area, that roads, tunnels, bridges, as your report points out, troop habitats, permanent defenses, and even what the Home Minister is currently visiting, vibrant villages as a mirror of what the Chinese are doing. all that is happening in that area.
That's right. And as the ambassador was saying, all our attention since 2020 has been focused on Ladakh because of the border tensions there and the Chinese buildup there that occurred in 2020. But what the December 9th incident shows us is that we cannot take our eyes off of what's happening in the eastern sector, particularly in the Tawang area, since, as the ambassador pointed out, this has been a focal point for India-China tensions for a long time. It was Tawang when the Chinese invaded during the 1962 war. One of the areas was Tawang. They, of course, vacated Tawang, and India now controls it. But this has been a sensitive area for a long time, and I think that we're going to continue to see India focusing on developing infrastructure in this area, in addition to the Ladakh area. India does have its hands full with protecting, a 2,000-mile border that separates India and China, disputed border, that is. So they have their work cut out for them. But we have seen the budgets have been increasing for infrastructure development. Of course, a major stride ahead was made with the road going to Depsang Oldie Air Base in northern Ladakh. This was something that India had been working on for a long time. There's another road they're constructing in the eastern sector as well. So these things take time, but India has been putting in the effort to developing this infrastructure now for over a decade. So I think we'll begin to see the fruits of that moving forward. And the other thing that India has to keep an eye on is the villages on the Chinese side, that they are building up these villages. They have loyalty from the people living in these villages who can report on things that are happening on the border. So India also has to be very cognizant of that as well, and ensuring that the economic development is happening in these areas, so that people are staying in these border areas on the Indian side as well. So it is, the infrastructure piece is extremely important, but India knows this, and I think they've been focusing on it more and more in the last decade and a half, in addition to the military capability side, which is also extremely important, and we can talk about that as well.
Sure. Ambassador Rao, there were reports that suggested U.S. real-time intelligence helped India before and during Yangtse, though personally speaking, we saw a huge increase in Indian ISR capabilities in the Tawang area on its own.
Well, there were reports even after the Galwan incident about the fact that India and the U.S. were collaborating in terms of, using intelligence to understand the situation better. And the U.S. as a very close partner, one of our main partners today, strategic partners today, we are bound to have such collaboration. And Lisa just pointed to the exercises that had taken place, the Yudh Abhyas exercises that had taken place in Uttarakhand in December, very close to the Yangtze incident, just prior to that. So all this points to the fact that India and the United States have developed and are developing a network of collaboration which involves intelligence sharing and helping enhance our own surveillance capabilities, without doubt. But let us also understand that we have been in these areas. The Indian Army has been in these areas now for decades, and they have built up a knowledge base, an awareness system of these areas that I think is quite unparalleled in terms of understanding the lay of the land and the situation, emerging situation. So in that sense, we are very, very well equipped when it comes to dealing with the Chinese. Very, very different from the situation that we were faced with in 1962. So China has a formidable opponent in India today.
Sure. Ms. Curtis, again, like the Ambassador pointed out, it's not just Yangtze. If that happened, Galwan as well, there was intelligence sharing, winter clothing. You, in your report, also have a few recommendations for ISR and satellite imagery that should be released to the public, possibly to make them more aware. And if could get your comments on the foundational agreements that India and the US have and how much that contributes to the ability to share real-time intelligence.
Yes, I think the foundational agreements that have been signed over the years have definitely allowed for greater cooperation between India and the United States. More recently, the Basic Exchange Cooperation Agreement, or the BECA agreement, has allowed for a lot of this geospatial information to be exchanged, which I think has helped India in terms of what's happening on the border with China. And you rightly pointed out that during the 2020 border crisis, the U.S. did increase its intelligence and information sharing with India, I think to India's benefit, much to India's benefit. You talked about the expedited winter military gear, but also the leasing of the 2 MQ-9B drones were very important for India. And in fact, India is looking at purchasing several of these drones for permanent use, which is something that would, I think, greatly assist them along the border, not only along the border, also in the naval space as well. So yes, in our report, we point out there are things the U.S. can do. Obviously, India is a very proud country. It can defend its own sovereignty. But at the same time, the U.S. Can offer its assistance. The U.S. very much wants to see India be able to protect its borders and fend off or deter Chinese aggression. And so this can come in the form of increased information exchange, messaging, talking about what India is doing, this land grabbing or salami slicing, whatever you want to call it, bringing that to global attention is important. And also, thinking about and sharing information about Chinese plans and intentions. I think this is very important for India and China to do. As the ambassador pointed out, India's had forces in these areas, understands the Chinese mindset in ways that the U.S. can't. But the U.S. also can bring to bear its own information gathering, intelligence techniques, and the two together, I think, can facilitate deterring China. It's all about deterring China, not allowing them to think they can keep nibbling away at territory and changing facts on the ground through their increased aggression. So I think all these things are important for the U.S. and India. You mentioned the commercial satellite imagery. There's a lot more of this available on, what's happening on the border. And our suggestion is that, some of that information come out, that be distributed so that it's not hidden what the Chinese are up to, that it's out there for everybody to see. So this is something that we recommend that could be helpful as deterrence. It's sort of along the same lines of what the U.S. did before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The U.S. released information that it had about Russia's intentions, what it intended to do. Of course, in that case, it didn't deter the Russians from acting, but at least it demonstrated to the world and didn't allow the Russians to use propaganda or tell lies about the Ukrainians after the fact. So it's the same idea. Get that information out there. Tell the world what China's up to, what it's doing, as an attempt to deter their actions.
Ambassador, you pointed out that 2023 is not like 1962, but India has always had to prepare to deal with a potential two-front war situation and avoid it. How should India be currently navigating these twin threats?
Well, with Pakistan, Pakistan has been a troublesome neighbor through the decades, and there's no question about the need for eternal vigilance and very high levels of preparedness when it comes to defending the LOC and our borders with Pakistan. There's no doubt about it, because the record of Pakistani behavior over the years doesn't instill confidence. However much people may talk about the need for peace and confidence building with Pakistan, the actual experience on the ground doesn't impart any confidence to us. When it comes to China, Amitabh, I always think of the last 30, 35 years in that relationship between India and China before Galwan happened, and before, you saw this increased assertiveness of the Chinese along the line of actual control. Actually, we built a system that pretty much held the peace for those 3 decades. We had those agreements on the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border areas, a series of agreements that basically prevented any armed conflict, any military confrontation from taking place. I think the time has come to really assess not only the utility of those agreements and what really went wrong. Why should things have broken down? And I believe that the talks that we are holding with the Chinese in Ladakh, for instance, to seek de-escalation and the disengagement between the two sides should go on. I believe there is need to ensure that we do not have armed military conflict between India and China, because it's not going to help either side. I say this not because I'm a peacenik, not because I'm being unrealistic, but I understand, having dealt with China in those 3 decades, that there was utility in the system that we had built up. We were not friends with the Chinese. We remained adversaries, but we built a system that held the peace. And I think we should not abandon that completely and say, the last three decades were a waste of time, and we should be looking at, a very different period in our relationship with China. And I think the government has handled this with great maturity, because they haven't, the way there's been very studied reactions to what the Chinese do. There are measured responses. That is certainly the way to go. And we've kept the channels of communication open, and the whole system of, the relationships that we have with Russia, with China, as much as we have a very close partnership with the United States. I think it's important for India to maintain these channels of communication, to operate them, to keep them functioning all the time, because ultimately you must understand, India is really that middle country. It is much more than China, a middle country between all these, different factions. And I think that our strength derives from that, and we should be able to deploy that with great agility, with flexibility, and that's really, I think, the direction in which we must go.
Ms. Curtis, what about some analysts who find a direct link between this increasing volatility along the LAC and China's rising threat perception of its own two-front challenges, east along the Pacific front and southwest along the Himalayan front?
Well, I think this is very interesting, and that gets back what I raised earlier, that it's difficult to know China's precise motivations for its actions. And if you look at the 2020 buildup along the line of actual control, China holds that it was a response to India's construction of the road to Depsang, which had been under construction for a long time, but it was completed, I believe, in December of 2019. So they point to that and say, they're just making sure that the border remains stable with, India's increased infrastructure buildup along the LAC. However, I think most analysts interpret that they are increasing the pressure along the LAC largely because they feel that they're, more militarily powerful, economically, that they have, surpassed India, and that they want to, show that they are the big country on the block, and that India needs to play by their rules. So I think that can be seen as a potential reason behind their increased aggression along the LAC since 2013, but in particular 2020, in just the last few years. So I think that that's something that we have to keep in mind. And if they were trying to dissuade India from moving forward with strategic relations with the United States or with the Quad, if that was the Chinese intention with their 2020 buildup, clearly it backfired, because what we saw is India has become more receptive to Quad cooperation since the 2020 Chinese military buildup. So that clearly has not worked, and one can only hope that the Chinese learn that lesson, that they saw that they can't cow India into not cooperating with Quad or the United States, that is not the approach that is going to get their desired result. But again, we sort of are guessing to some degree what China's motivations are. But I think we can deduce that it has something to do with them feeling like they have surpassed India in military economic terms, and that they want to be the regional hegemon and want to try to set the rules of the region. And unfortunately, or fortunately, this is not going to work when it comes to India and its position, particularly within South Asia. And it's not going to work for the United States either. So this is something that India and the United States agree on, and will continue to work together to thwart these Chinese ambitions for regional hegemony.
Ms. Curtis, just wanted to check, do you have time for a last couple of round of questions?
Maybe one more.
Right. Ambassador Rao, as Lisa Curtis was pointing out, the Quad has made strides that few thought possible till a few years ago.
Yes, definitely. And I think the whole structure of the relationship we are building within the Quad, with our partners within the Quad, is certainly the way to go, because India is definitely an Indo-Pacific country. And, Lisa's and Eric's paper mentions the issue of deterrence and denial. And certainly those are options, those are choices that India definitely should adopt, because even as we seek disengagement and de-escalation of tensions with China along our 3,488 kilometer long border between the two countries, we have to think of the whole issue of how we balance China, how we deter China, how we are able to kind of neutralize, the damage it is trying to create on our borders, a damage to our interests in terms of its relationship with Pakistan, the kind of profile that it is building up in South Asia, in our own neighborhood. Definitely, India has every right and every reason to look at the options and the choices that it must adopt in order to strengthen its own position and its capacity and its capabilities. It's essentially about capacity building, Amitabh. And certainly the Quad is an option, is the choice, is the path that we must take in order to strengthen that position that we want.
And Ms. Curtis, finally, recommendations in your report suggesting that the U.S. should be prepared to extend full support to India in the event of another border crisis or conflict. You say that, and on the ground also, it seems like those will continue. What does full support mean?
Well, first, full support means, number one, listening to Indian officials, what they need or what they are looking for. And I point this out because during the Trump administration, in which I was serving in the National Security Council during the 2020 border crisis, it was important to India that the U.S. not get out ahead of Indian statements, that the U.S. not be more hawkish and more forthright in its statements than even India. So I think it's important for the U.S. to listen to India and figure out what India is looking for and what its needs are, and following India's lead, as it were, with what they're looking for. But also, we mentioned in the report that full support means providing India the types of military capabilities that they need. And there are still some barriers on sharing of certain technologies from the U.S. to India. So I think we need to look carefully at removing some of those barriers. And I'm happy to say we are moving in the right direction. The U.S. is considering co-producing jet engine technology with India. This would be a major breakthrough if this is actually announced, perhaps during the upcoming visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States. Those are the kinds of things that would show that the U.S. is prepared to fully support India as it faces down Chinese aggression.
Lisa Curtis, absolutely appreciate you sharing your time, experience, and expertise with us here on StratNews Global.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Pleasure's been all ours. Ambassador, I know Lisa has an appointment, that's why I let her go, but just one last final question to you. Taiwan, Tibet, one China policy. Do you see any time in the future when the US or India will have to change that policy, Ambassador?
It would all depend on how the situation in Taiwan develops and the moves that the Chinese make. If we are going to see a conflict situation develop in the Taiwan Straits, everything really becomes so fluid. As far as India's policy is concerned, its one China policy is concerned, I don't think we have really deviated from it, although we haven't been, expressing our position on it over the last few years. But the fact is, we have never questioned the status of Taiwan or the approach of China on the Taiwan issue. So let me leave it there. As far as Tibet is concerned, of course, long, long ago, almost 70 years ago, we conceded that Tibet was a part of China when we signed that Panchsheel agreement between India and China in April of 1954, exactly 69 years ago. So can we change that situation? Can we turn back the pages of history? That's very, very difficult to say, because we have the might of China, the military might of China occupying the Tibetan plateau today. And, doing away with that, I cannot visualize a cataclysmic event that would completely change that situation. So I think the option for India today is essentially to keep alive the flame of Tibetan identity. We have preserved the spirit of the Tibetan people here among the refugee community, and the fact that His Holiness the Dalai Lama remains an honored guest of the Indian government and its people. And I think that is where perhaps India can become a kind of conscience keeper as far as Tibet is concerned. The fact that there are these people who have been, in a sense, deprived of their homeland. We have seen the whole question of Tibetan identity subsumed into a larger Chinese identity within the People's Republic of China. So that diversity that really makes for a rich civilizational state is now absent in China today. It is very much present here in India with our respect for diversity and plurality. And I think our approach to Tibet, our approach particularly to the Tibetan community, to the Tibetan people, in a sense takes its strength from our ability to respect diversity.
Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, again, absolutely a pleasure having you on StratNews Global, ma'am. And thank you so much for taking out time and taking all the trouble to give us this interview.
Thank you so much, Amitabh. Always a pleasure.
And to our viewers, do send us feedback on this series, Borderline Xi, or any of the other videos that we put up. You can also send your suggestions. Do follow our social media handles. If you follow the Telegram channel, you will get updates as soon as we put them up on our website, or interviews like this with Ambassador Rao and Lisa Curtis that we put up on YouTube. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.